Thanks. Um, First, I'd like to congratulate BMI on organizing this day. It's a really good program, and I hope everyone, including myself, will gain something out of it at the end of the morning session and the one that follows the tea break. I believe that the questions, the topics that have been allocated have been actually, these are the questions that you want us to address and to give you some advice on. And by no means am I saying that within the 20 minutes that I have that I'll be able to address everything concerned or associated with abdominal pain, and there may be scenarios where you may not get the answer from this talk. But what I'm going to do is to try to talk a bit about acute abdominal pain, which is always refer, chronic abdominal pain, which is the difficult bit, and then the previous two speakers have mentioned calprotectin, and I'll talk a bit about calprotectin because very soon, well, hopefully very soon, this will be a test that you would be doing. Okay, so just a bit about epidemiology. 25% in the UK population have upper abdominal pain at some time or another, and in the US this is about 22%. And this is within a month of the consultation in primary care. Medical Research Council survey showed that 20% of children had abdominal pain at some time during their consultation with their GPs. If you look at these figures, in the UK, abdominal and pelvic pain accounted for 248,000 admissions in hospital, which total up to 67 million pounds. And this was in 2004, so at that time it was about 135 pounds a day for an inpatient admission. And if you look at the primary care, the figures are pretty much similar in 2005. 63 million pounds was spent by the primary care doctors for tackling abdominal pain. But that was when it was 43 pounds a consultation, and I'm sure the figures have gone up, with time. But that just gives an idea that the amount of money that the NHS spends in primary and secondary care is about equal. Obviously, we get less referrals for abdominal pain, but the cost incurred per day of admission is much more. And it is about 7% of A&D attendances in total. And this graph just gives you an idea. This is from 2007. This was a Swedish group, and I'm a bit surprised by this because this is a Swedish group that interrogated a UK database on all the referrals for primary care for abdominal pain. And this paper doesn't have any UK author on it, which I find a bit surprising, but obviously the people on the content are much more active in this kind of research. And this slide shows that the abdominal pain is obviously much more common in women than in men, and it is more common in women in the 22, 29, 30 age group, but around 50 years of age, these lines start coming together, and the number of men who start complaining of chronic abdominal pain goes up as well. And this was a study that was done. They looked at 30,000 patients with a diagnosis of abdominal pain, and there are 30,000 age and sex match controls. The abdominal pain incidence was 22 per 1,000 person years. It was more in men as compared to, more in women as compared to men. It was almost twice in women as compared to men. A third of the patients were below 20 years of age, and we all come across patients, especially young females, with chronic abdominal pain. And they were more likely to get patients who came with chronic abdominal pain were more likely to get a diagnosis from the hospital of an acute abdominal problem or a problem that's kind of, acute on chronic. So some of these patients do need to be referred for secondary care attention. This is another publication from 2000, where all the primary consultations with regard to GI complaints was looked at, and this constituted about 8 to 10% of all the consultations that were in primary care. And out of these, as you can see here, abdominal pain was 6.1 per 1,000 patient years, and combined with diarrhea and constipation, these are the three main ones that the GP saw the patients with the three main complaints: abdominal pain, diarrhea, and constipation. You got a bit of regurgitation there, a bit of nausea there, and then gastric pain. So this is quite a busy slide. Acute abdominal pain, I won't spend too much time on it. Just to say that acute abdominal pain, it's always important to remember that upper abdominal pain can be related to the chest. And similarly, lower chest pain can be related to the abdomen, upper abdominal organs. So acute abdominal pain, always refer. It could be a myocardial infarction, it could be diabetic ketoacidosis, and it could be pneumonia. And this is often we see even, A&D doctors refer patients treated for pulmonary embolism and we find this is actually acute cholecystitis, or the other way around, when the patient has acute cholecystitis, comes with a positive D-dimer and is treated for pneumonia because of some kind of shadowing in the right lung base and turns out to be something different. It can work both ways. And you've always got to remember that especially patients with inferior myocardial infarction can just present with epigastric pain. So just to be conscious of the fact that it could be the lower chest that could be involved, presenting as upper abdominal pain, and conversely, it could be upper abdominal organs coming as chest pain. Sickle cell crisis, hypercalcemia, we don't see many of those. This is a very important reason, ectopic pregnancy. And I'll show you an algorithm that I have adapted from the one that is printed in e-guidelines. Always in women of childbearing age, beta HCG is an absolute must. We have seen patients with negative beta HCG who have gone to theater with ruptured ectopics from A&E. Obviously, placental abruption, vaginal bleeding. Surgical causes are all listed there. The one that is important is bowel ischemia, and I'll talk a bit about it in one of the subsequent slides. Again, a very busy slide just to tell you about the various diagnoses. And again, just to point out, right upper quadrant pain could be pneumonia, just to bring home that point again. And left upper quadrant pain could also be pneumonia on the left side. And all of you know that acute pancreatitis can present with left-sided left lower chest pain and pleural effusion on the left side. And especially in travelers who have come from the Asian subcontinent or Africa, you've got to be careful that a patient with chronic abdominal right upper quadrant pain is not a liver abscess, which is not mentioned in this. It could present quite acutely, especially if it's about to rupture. And then the lower abdominal organs, similarly, I mean, this list and this list are pretty much same, but this is the one that I want to take your attention to, psoas abscess, which should have been there on this side as well. But anybody with right lower or left lower quadrant pain in the groin, just make sure that, I mean, right lower quadrant you'll probably refer with appendicitis, but just make sure this is not a psoas abscess, and the left, obviously, again, a psoas abscess can be there. And one's got to be careful. If the main thing is if the patient is keeping their leg flexed at the hip joint and they can't straighten it out, then that means it's a pelvic psoas abscess. And if you try to straighten the leg, they will have abdominal pain because the psoas sheath is being stretched. Immunocompromised patients, you've just got to be a bit careful because they don't present with normal signs of acute abdominal pain. They can have various pathologies, gastritis, hepatic pathologies. They can have Clostridium difficile colitis, abdominal tuberculosis. They can have disseminated tuberculosis by these rarer organisms. And they can have the side effects of the antiretrovirals, chemotherapy, and other treatments. When we talk about immunocompromised patients, this is not only patients with HIV, we are talking of patients with rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease who are on strong immunosuppressants, including biological therapy. So this is not confined to HIV patients alone. And just a slide on elderly patients, peptic ulcer disease, cholecystitis, acute pancreatitis is not the problem. Mesenteric ischemia and infarction, again, very important, very easy to miss. You have to have a very high index of suspicion for patients with chronic abdominal pain who have mesenteric ischemia. And we recently presented a case at our grand round where actually the patient died because the diagnosis probably was not made in time. And you have a very high index of suspicion for anybody with chronic abdominal pain and weight loss, which comes on after eating, to make sure this is not mesenteric infarction, especially in patients who are arteriopaths with cardiovascular disease or strokes or other risk factors. Urinary retention, these are all kind of commonly seen things. So chronic abdominal pain is a more difficult one to tackle. When to refer to secondary care, and quickly go through this. More than 60 years of age, obviously, abdominal mass, any other organ involved, organ enlarged, anybody with GI bleed, unexplained weight loss. If the patient comes to your surgery with repeatedly for the same problem, or there's a change in the pattern of consultation, then that should be a red flag, and the patient should be referred to secondary care. Anemia and rectal bleeding, we've already spoken about. Family history of bowel cancer or ovarian cancer, just be careful that if they have a strong family history, then it'd be better to refer them early than to wait too long, because it may run in families and they may have bowel cancer or ovarian cancer. Raised inflammatory markers, you would obviously refer, and any abnormality on rectal or pelvic examination. I'm not sure whether you do pelvic examinations, some GP surgeries do, but if there is an abnormality, obviously you would refer them to secondary care. You've heard a bit about irritable bowel syndrome, and this was the original Manning criteria, which I still think is very, very relevant. 6 criteria: pain relief with defecation, more frequent stools at the onset of pain, looser stools at the onset of pain, visible abdominal distension or bloating, passage of mucus, and a sensation of incomplete evacuation. More the number of factors, the more likely the patient has irritable bowel syndrome. This was superseded by Rome 1, 2, 3, but before Rome came in NICE, who have put in their criteria for, and this has been taken from the e-guidelines, which you all get a copy of. And they have said this is the NICE criteria for IBS: abdominal pain or discomfort either relieved by defecation or associated with altered bowel frequency or stool form. So which is pretty much same as the Manning criteria, and you have seen the Rome criteria already. Two of these four should be present: either altered stool passage, which is straining, urgency, incomplete evacuation, abdominal bloating, passage of mucus. So basically this is just playing around with words, but it all comes back to the same thing, that there should be a change in frequency of bowel movement, change in the form of bowels, either constipated or diarrhea, passage of mucus, abdominal bloating. They should be chronic. And NICE has included pain made worse by eating, I think just to incorporate upper GI symptoms which may be irritable bowel-like. So I think that's the only reason they've included this as one of the criteria. But lethargy, nausea, backache, and bladder symptoms are quite common in patients with irritable bowel syndrome. I won't dwell too much on this slide because you've already seen this before, and it's exactly similar but in a different format. It is important to note that patients who have irritable bowel syndrome have got other symptoms like pelvic pain, dyspareunia, fibromyalgia, headaches, backaches, genitourinary symptoms, irritable bladders, sleep disturbances. And you can do this Carnet test, which is just to say that it is subcutaneous. But sometimes patients say they've got the pain exactly at this point. If you ask them to lift their legs up, and the pain becomes more prominent, and you can feel something in the subcutaneous or musculoskeletal area, then that is not inside the abdomen, it is outside somewhere in the musculoskeletal, in the muscles or in the subcutaneous tissue. And that is Carnet test, which would go against a diagnosis of a functional bowel disorder, any intra-abdominal pathology. So this is just a study from 1991, quite an old study, but still relevant. I just ask you to look at this side of the table. Back pain 68%, lethargy 70%, headaches 34%, urinary frequency 52%, urgency 40%, bladder emptying, incomplete bladder emptying, dyspareunia, thigh pain. So all these, pretty much 50% of the patients have other symptoms associated with the bowel symptoms. And this is an algorithm which is in e-guidelines. Sorry, it's just under BMI healthcare in there, so it's just got cover, and I think this is coming in the way as well. But there's a reference at the bottom, which is e-guidelines 2013, and I just adapted this a bit. So if a patient has irritable bowel syndrome, which has been symptoms for about 6 months or so, if there are any red flags which we have discussed before, then you should refer them. If there are no red flags, I think while putting them on the BMI format, these arrows have just moved around a bit, I think, for some reason. I think I sent a slide in a different format, and I think when they put it on the BMI template, it's all gone a bit. So, so if there are no red flags, and if the NICE IBS criteria are satisfied, which we have just discussed before, oh dear, this has gone all over the place now. This was the most important slide, I think, for you guys, but it's gone. So if the NICE IBS criteria are satisfied, then you do these tests. You do a full blood count, you do a CRP, you do a celiac screen, you do a thyroid function test, and you do a fecal calprotectin, which I will discuss in a moment, and then I've added this beta HCG for anyone of childbearing age. If the NICE IBS criteria are not satisfied, then you should refer them anyway to secondary care. If these tests that you do are all negative, then you can treat them in primary care. If any of these tests are positive, or there is any other clinical suspicion or red flag, then you have to refer them to secondary care. Sorry, there's a bit of a mess this, but I hope we can always alter this slide and give you a copy if we can. I've got it on my memory stick, so we can print out copies and give it to you at the end. So fecal calprotectin, both the previous speakers have mentioned it. It is coming. We are at this point of time discussing a business case, or writing up a business case for this to be rolled out. It is in the NICE is coming out with fecal calprotectin on the 2nd of October this year. The consultation process is already over, and their final guidelines should be published on the 2nd of October this year. So hopefully we will have it all ready by then for you to start doing fecal calprotectin. What is fecal calprotectin? It's a calcium and zinc binding neutrophil protein, which constitutes 60% of the total proteins in the cytosol of the neutrophils. It is released from activated leukocytes. So when the bowel is inflamed, calprotectin is released. It can be found in plasma, serum, spinal fluid, synovial fluid, urine, saliva, and stool. So all body secretions can have calprotectin, and is increased during bacterial infections or inflammation in the relevant organs. It is, if you don't have calprotectin, you can't survive. It's absolutely essential. Everybody has calprotectin. It is an antimicrobial and has induced apoptosis or programmed cell death in all cell types, whether they are human cells, animal cells, normal cells, malignant cells. Levels strongly correlate with a white cell scan. So white cell scan hones on to the area of inflammation, and the levels of calprotectin, fecal calprotectin, strongly correlates with the area of inflammation. It is extremely stable in stool for over 7 days at room temperature, and it's an ELISA test from 15 to 25 pounds. We probably should get a deal at 15 pounds, I think. These are the limits of normal. Once children have a higher rate or higher level of fecal calprotectin, 166, 51, and 122. Normal is 0 to 50 in adults. If it's 50 to 120, or some people say 200 or 150, you can test it again. Anything beyond 150 or 200 should be referred to secondary care for further tests. This is just a graph that shows you the fecal calprotectin level in patients with abdominal discomfort, which is an observational study in 2012. These are the area under the curves, or the ROC curves, and this is the total ROC curve. ROC of 87.7% is very, very good. For the colon, the ROC curve is even better, 91%. For small bowel inflammation, slightly lower, but it's still pretty good at 73. So these are all very good figures, and it shows you that the bowel is inflamed either in the small bowel or the colon. If the fecal calprotectin is normal, then it's a very low likelihood that the patient has major pathological disease in the bowel. Although fecal calprotectin does have day-to-day variation, and you may need to repeat it, and the stool sample has to be as voluminous as possible. So it's not a 50 ml bottle. If there's a canister of stools, it's even better. It can be done on solid stool, liquid stools, black stools, white stools, whatever, doesn't matter really. Calprotectin and Crohn's disease. This is the simple endoscopic score for Crohn's disease. As the endoscopic severity increases, the fecal calprotectin increases. Inactive, mild, moderate, severe, the fecal calprotectin exponentially increases as well. If you compare various disorders, Crohn's disease, high fecal calprotectin, ulcerative colitis, high fecal calprotectin, neoplasia, you've already heard, it's not very good. It can't be used to rule out cancer. That's a very important learning point. Even if the fecal calprotectin is normal, patient may still have bowel cancer. IBS patients, quite low, and healthy subjects, again, quite low. So the conclusions are, abdominal pain with other symptoms is a common presenting complaint in primary care. Red flag symptoms or signs or investigations should be used as criteria for referral to secondary care. You should be beware of old people, immunosuppressed patients, and pregnant patients where chronic abdominal pain or acute on chronic abdominal pain can be missed out for simple pathology and there is something more serious going on. And fecal calprotectin is now going to be introduced as a test to differentiate irritable bowel syndrome from inflammatory bowel disease. And it will also be used in secondary care to monitor patients with known inflammatory bowel disease to see if the patients are in remission or to even predict flare-ups. And if a patient has positive fecal calprotectin, then they should be referred. Thank you very much for your attention.